Thank you. All right, I'm gonna do something a little different. I'm gonna do my best to be a little vulnerable, a little self-deprecating. So to do that, I need a little bit of help from you guys to get started. It's very easy. You don't have to get out of your chair. What I need is for you all to smile at me. Big smiles. Okay, now what I need you to do is to do this right here. Of course, that's what we had to do. Okay. I'm not used to walking around with a mic. I feel like, I try not to do that either. Let me get us started in this way. Every single thing you see at this exact moment, the glass, the bottle of water, your phone, the tablecloth, whatever the case may be. Every single achievement you have ever accomplished, every single thing that we know has its origin in a thought. Somewhere, someone decided they were going to make tablecloths. Somebody. And because of that, they put together all the elements that were necessary in the team. Someone learned how to do it from that very single thought to the point now that they sit around and we don't even know they're here. When you achieve something, some of you were amazing athletes in high school. I was not. But some of you, at some point in time, you said, I'm going to do this. My daughter, Landry, she's a petite girl. She's got terrible scoliosis. And she came home and said, I'm going to be in the marching band, and I want to do the bass drum, the big, giant bass drum. And his parents were like, that's fantastic. And she walks out of the room, and they're like, ain't no way that girl's ever going to walk around with it. And then she did it for 3 years, and it's probably the highlight of her high school career. Because at some point in time, she said, this is what I'm going to do. Literally every single thing we know, bump into, is based upon the origin of thought. Which means, and I'm so excited about this, lining up what everyone has already said here, if we get control of our thoughts, if we train our thoughts, truly what we can accomplish is limitless. I love to tell stories. Let me share a story with you. My first job out of college was I was a high school English teacher, and I taught at an alternative school for at-risk youth. It was part of my school system's design to help with the dropout rate. They had a terribly low graduation rate. And they're like, what are we going to do? So kudos to them, they put money and started a school. And to qualify to get to my school, you had to have been expelled from another high school. So you can imagine a little bit of what the population was like. 60% of the young girls in our school were either pregnant or had children. Why? Because they just missed so many days. But then we also had drug dealers. We had violent offenders. We had everything in there. And I loved it. I was 23. I had all the energy. It was going to change the world. But navigating the classroom was difficult. Now, one of the best things my principal ever did is she said, listen, in North Carolina, 12th grade English is British lit. She's like, you only have to do two things. I don't care what you do in that classroom. You have to teach British lit, and they have to pass the end of grade exams. But I'm not coming in there and just micromanaging, are you following the curriculum? You do those two things, these kids graduate, and they pass the EOGs, I'm fine. I loved it. I absolutely loved the freedom. But I'm also teaching Shakespeare to the population of students I just mentioned. And so I would try in every way to be creative. And one of my favorite units of the year was Frankenstein. I love Frankenstein. Did you know that book was written on a dare? Mary Shelley's sitting around there drinking and smoking. They're like, we should write a horror gothic novel, or whatever they called it. And she was the only one who did it. It's only like 120 pages, and there's dozens and dozens of movies based on it. So this is what I did. I got my students together, and we literally read it out loud, all 120 pages, a little bit every single day. And the culmination was that we were going to write and direct and put on a 15-minute play of Frankenstein. Now, I wish I had like that School of Rock moment where we didn't win any awards. I think we put on one production for about 5 people, but it was wonderful. But I, as the director, had to figure out every kid had to have a role. And I had this student, his name was Derek, and he was he was the most difficult student I had. Constantly gave me the most, trouble after trouble after trouble. And I didn't know what to do with him. So I'm like, okay, maybe I should make Derek the creature. Maybe he can identify with being an outcast. I mean, he's the one kind of busting through the room at all the time. Maybe he's the one that should be the creature. Maybe he should be Victor. Maybe he's the misguided genius. Maybe he'll love playing that role. And then I had a thought one night. I should step out of the way and let Derek be the director. I should put Derek in charge of the other so-called misfits in my class. It would mean I would get time with him every single day. It would mean he would have to figure out to speak to someone in a way that wasn't angry or violent, and that took a while to figure out. All of a sudden, I did that, and Derek began to take ownership of this awful little play that we were writing. The whole play, 15 minutes, you had to cover the whole story. And we brought in the principal and the assistant principal and the janitor, and we put on this 15-minute production. And in that one tiny little moment, Derek flourished. Now, I don't know where Derek is today. I don't know where he is on Facebook. I mean, I found students these days. I haven't found Derek. But I asked myself when I look back at what changed for Derek, and it wasn't me. It's Derek changed the way he thought about himself. For that one moment, for that 1 month that we did Frankenstein, because he wasn't a good student after that. It didn't reform him into making him the best student ever. I wish it did. That's not that story. But for that one moment, Derek changed the way he thought about himself and the way he interacted with his fellow students. And I hope Derek has gone on to have a wonderful life. But for a 23-year-old English teacher who was more naive than educated, I thought, that's what I've got to try to do. And so I've been fortunate in my careers along the way. That's what I've tried to develop in others, constantly having to do it for myself. And what I'm hoping we can do here in this very brief amount of time, it'd be a little bit of naive ambition on my part, is that we can understand a little bit better about the way we think about ourselves. And then once we understand that concept of self a little bit better, that's point one, then we're going to understand ourself in community. And then my favorite, that third one, is going to be ourself in achievement, when we're going after those goals and the things that so we're going to talk about self, we're going to talk about self in community, and we're going to talk about self as it relates to our achievements. So let's talk about the concept of self. I'm not the first person to do that. I'm not a philosopher. I'm none of those things. It's interesting. There's been a concept of self forever, right? As a man thinketh, so he is. Those kind of things. But the psychology of the self-image is really only about 150 years old. Like, we really didn't understand how our self-image impacts us. And whether you know it or not, each one of you have a developed sense of self. You may not be aware of it. It's that subconscious that Mary was talking about. You have thought about it. You've thought about you more than you've thought about any other person. We're all inherently selfish inside our brains. And so we have this automatic running system that just happens in our brain, the way we think about ourselves and the way we interact. And if that's not a thought out and deliberate system, we begin doing things and we might say, why in the world did I do that? But as we grow and begin to develop the sense of self, then we have an ability to be very specific with our actions and very specific with our words. Now, for me, I do my best to make my operating system the Imago Dei. Does anyone know what that is? It's Latin for the image of God. And so for my faith, I believe that I and all of you have been created in the image of God. That every one of you have an inherent worth, created by love and worthy by the mere fact that you bear the image of God. Now, I understand that there's different approaches to that, and I respect that and appreciate it, but that's my operating system. And so what I remind myself, I do my best to remind myself, is that it is okay for me to want good things for myself. And it is okay for me to want good things for you. And when I become too discouraged or I start to beat myself up too much, I have to remind myself that I have this inherent worth that I've created with worthiness and love. And we all know, as we wrestle with the thoughts inside our head, how difficult that is. And I want to offer to you that those things can begin to either be transformed or developed on your behalf with a single thought. Let me share another story. I grew up in rural North Carolina, Smithfield, North Carolina. What it's famous for is not that great. Tobacco and racism. That's the two things we're famous for. And I did not grow up wealthy. I remember my mom buying my tennis shoes at the grocery store. And so in 1982, when Nikes and Izods and popped-up collars and things were important, wearing tennis shoes from the grocery store did not help for one's self-image. But I was completely unaware of my self-image at that point. My parents, they owned a flower shop. And so they were business owners and entrepreneurs. My father was also a pastor, and he taught piano. And I didn't understand streams of income at that point in time, but apparently those three weren't enough. And so the house, in 1982, we lived downtown Smithfield. I could walk to my friend's house. I could walk to my parents' flower shop. It's sort of that idyllic image you have of kids riding around on bicycles. That was us. And then in 1982, my mom and dad tell us we have to move. I don't want to move. I like to be able to walk where I want to go and ride our bikes downtown. But the reason we had to move is because the bank was foreclosing on our home. Now, foreclosure is something I think most of us in the room understand. At some point in time, the bank just says, you're not catching up. So we're going to take this from you. So we moved from downtown Smithfield to Brogden. Do you know where Brogden is? Laura and I are from very similar paths. Brogden's not a city. It's not a town. It's a community. It's famous for the birthplace of Ava Gardner, if anybody knows who Ava Gardner is. But Brogden is way out in the country. I can't walk to a friend's house. I can't walk to my parents' flower shop. I can walk into the woods, which has its own inherent fun, I guess, for a kid. But I didn't want to. Already, I felt like an outcast because of my clothing and things like that. Now I'm going to live out in the country. And we had chickens and goats and hay bales, and all those were completely foreign to me. But all of a sudden, it was my job to go get the chickens and get the eggs and to catch the goats when they escaped. None of that was anything I had ever done before. And it's not fun to explain any of that to your parents. To my friends. But again, I had a wonderfully loving home. I was the youngest of 5. I was very blessed. But what I began to notice is, as the youngest of 5, my oldest brother, he went off to the Air Force. He's like, I'm out of here. And it was good for him. My 2 oldest sisters went into administrative or secretarial work, if you will. My brother right above me struggled to figure out what he was going to do. Just really didn't know. And I had no idea. Maybe the military, but really no idea whatsoever what I wanted to do. So senior year, March my senior year, college is not on the radar. I hadn't taken the SAT, nothing. I didn't know what I was going to do. And my friend Corey, his nickname was Corky. So Corky comes up to me and he goes, hey man, let's go to ECU. We could room together. Now, ECU is East Carolina University, famous for Sandra Bullock. We just barely missed each other. Where's Amy? Sorry. Just barely. She graduated right before I did. Gordon, let's go to ECU. And in less time than I've told this story, I said, that's great. Let's do it. It's the entire thought process to where I am standing here today. I didn't have any money. I hadn't taken the SAT, so I didn't go online. I found out where the SAT was. My school wouldn't help me. I spent my last year at a small Christian school, and they told me it was wrong to not go to a Christian college, so they wouldn't help me in any of these things. So I had to figure out how to do all that, and then there was no money, and I owned 2 things of value in the world. I had a pearl drum kit that was just my prized possession. But you can't take a drum kit to the dorm room. So I sold my drum kit. And you can see how much of a nerd I was. And I sold about half my comic book collection, which in 1989 had a little bit of value. And I got together enough money to pay for my first semester of college. And then and I never went home again. I loved my parents, the sweetest people on the face of the planet. But when I left. I was like, I worked my summers at summer camps because they would feed me. And they would pay me $100 a week, and I had no expenses. So I was like, why would I go home? I never went home again because when I left. There was something inherent in me that was like, I've got to leave Smithfield. College, school teacher, management, sales, seminary, master's degree, planted 2 churches, started 3 businesses, and here I am. I don't say that as pride. I just say that's the string that all comes from the genesis of one thought. Let's go to East Carolina University together. Now, we all have a tendency to remember the bad ones. hey, let's stay out and go drinking, or I'm sober enough to drive home. You know what I mean? I don't assume that about any of you. I'm saying we have a tendency to only remember the bad. I should have never gone on a date with that boy or that girl. Those are the ones we have a tendency to remember, right? We would do better to remember the genesis of thought of the one. We would do even better to remember that's still the possibility for us today. Your operating system and what you think about yourself is how you make every single decision. I don't want to talk about community yet. I want to talk about you. What you think about yourself when you look in the mirror is based upon your thought of self, right? That's your impression, right? When someone asks you, will you want to do something, your choice to do it or not do it is based upon what you think upon yourself. When you reflect on what happened yesterday, it's really based upon not what happened yesterday, but what you think about yourself. So as you begin to transform your idea of self, it begins to transform every part of your life. Like your brain doesn't know the difference between a dream and a memory. Did you know that? It really doesn't. The dream you had last night in your brain, it's the same chemical that has a goal. Like your brain doesn't know what to do with it. When you see people on television, you go, that person's delusional. You just don't like their delusion. You like yours. Your impression of yourself is no different than the person who jumps off and thinks I can fly with their own arms. We're all based the exact same way. Our brains just don't know the difference. So you can, as Mary spoke of and as Chris, I mean, we can train and grow our brains. You're not a victim to your thoughts. You're the owner. You're the creator of your thoughts. And so when we get towards the end, I want to give us maybe some practical exercises. But I want us to understand first and foremost is that your thoughts are your own. You're the author. You're the creator. Yes, they're thoughts and things that people have said about us that we've got to get out. But we can, in a moment, realize that I have the power of my own thought. And I'm not discounting mental conditions or any of those things at all. Please hear me. I want to be sympathetic to all of that. I've got a brain damage. I understand that. But we can take over in exercises and purposefulness the way we think about ourselves. And it really just takes the power of one thought. But we all know that none of us live alone. We're here in community. All of this is ourself and community. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let me ask you this question. Have you ever walked into a room and said, who am I today? Here's what I mean. You might walk into the room and say, wait a minute, am I mom? Am I wife? Am I business owner? Am I a lover, friend? Like, I don't actually know who I'm supposed to be in the room right now. Have you thought to yourself, I'm supposed to be smart in this room? Or I'm supposed to be in charge of this room? Who you think about in community matters. Some of you know, I used to be a full-time pastor of a church, and Capitalized was something I did part-time, and I enjoyed doing both. But instead, I have a tendency to work in coffee shops. That's sort of my habit. And so I would wake up on Monday morning and do my normal routine, and then I would head downtown and sit in a coffee shop. And I would typically work there most of the morning. And I found myself sometimes walking in the room, sitting down, setting up the coffee shop. I've got my black coffee. And people would walk in, I knew, and then I would have to stop and ask myself, who am I today? Like if they begin asking me questions, am I answering questions as a pastor, or am I answering questions as a marketing person? Am I a business coach, or am I a counselor? And sometimes we all know those things are very similar. But I would literally ask myself some days, I don't know who I'm supposed to be today. Because who I am in community is completely intertwined. So what I'd have to do is I would have to say, okay, from the morning until noon on Mondays, I'm only a pastor. I'm returning phone calls, I'm setting up appointments, I'm working on the next week's service, I'm planning out the music, all the things, the minutia that goes in with that. And then I would stop at lunch and try to have a hard break, and I would try to eat something. And then I'd say, oh, okay, well then from 1 to 5, then I'm working on social media or I'm making a proposal. Because I was honestly having difficulty figuring out who I was in the room. Now, we don't always get that sort of opportunity, we don't always get to have a dichotomy like that. We do have to exist as multiple people all at the same time. And if you have a home where there's a spouse and there's children, that's 100% true. When you've got little kids, there's time you look at your spouse and you go, we're roommates at the present moment. Because all we're doing is trying to keep these little animals alive. And by the time they go to sleep, I don't have any time for you at all. So let's be good roommates. You don't want to exist in that situation for long, but you also know that you are mom, you are dad, you are husband, wife, friend. And the difficulty for us is figuring out how to interact. I'm not asking you or encouraging you to be singular at every moment. There's moments where you get to do that. That's beautiful. It's rare. We only get to be one person at one time. That happens. But not very often. What I'm asking you to recognize is that your sense of self is what's going to influence each and every one of those relationships. And if we are operating off unhealthy views of self, like constant condemnation, constant criticism, bringing up the things that should be that are unforgivable, that we just can't get out of our head, when we do that, it influences how we interact with community, which means that we're called to try to live some sort of pathway of mental health so that when we're interacting with others, we're able to do so as cleanly and as healthfully as possible. And what that means is sometimes we have to say, I forget, I've heard so many great talks today, this person's, I think it was Mary, this person's energy I just don't have, they can't be a part of what I'm doing right now. I was listening to a philosopher the other day. His name is the Big Aristotle. Does anyone know who the Big Aristotle is? That's Shaquille O'Neal. That's what he calls himself, is the Big Aristotle. And he has what he calls 5-finger stress. He goes, I only got 5-finger stress in my life. I care what my mom has to say. I care what my kids have to say. I care about my bottom line. And he said, I think that's it. I've only got 3 fingers. He said outside of that, he doesn't care one bit about what anyone else thinks, but he says you should never have more than 5-finger stress in your life. Are there really 5 more than that you should care that much about? And listen, I'm a people pleaser. I want this to go well. I want smiles. I want people to say that was really great. And inherently, I think we're all wired to be people pleasers. Even if we're like, I don't care. I mean, there is an element where like, I want you to care enough for me to say I don't care, right? That's what we really mean. But eliminating situations and sometimes giving space to people to say, I can't be mentally healthy in a situation like that. Amy is the best at giving me that advice. She is. She's the quickest to say, that relationship or that scenario, I don't know why you're worried about it. And it takes me a long time to unwind in unhealthy relationships. Like it really does. I want to be loyal. A prior experience means something to me, right? I think it does to you too. You've gone through something, good or bad, and it's hard sometimes to say, I can't be around that right now. And I used to think, oh, that's hogwash. You can't start doing that to people. But if it's not spiteful, you're not doing it in a mean way, you're doing it for your own personal health. If you don't have your own personal health, it's hard to have what? A healthy relationship with anybody. We're constantly intertwined between our concept of self and our relationship with others. Which means it's not selfish for me, to people I love closely, to say, I need some mental health so that I can love you better. I need personal time. I need this thing